For the majority of my 20s, I've had a really hard time getting into books. Luckily, lately I've been sort of cracking the code in how to read books, and that is to read books that I'm interested in. These are some really interesting books that I think will captivate a bookworm and also sort of lure someone to whom reading doesn't come quite as naturally into reading again, and I just think that's terrific. Starting off with a book that's not so much about reading as it is doing, this is Generation T, 108 Ways to Transform a T-Shirt. Some of these are no-sew, some of these need rudimentary sewing. A lot of this is really fun early 2000s hipster culture. There's just some terrific graphics in here, as well as like terrific how-tos on how to transform t-shirts. This is a really terrific book that breaks through short attention spans, and it's especially great for fashion-minded girlies who want to upcycle or modify their clothes. Highly recommend. I got this for like $5 on eBay. It's just such a fun read. Next, also for the fashion-minded, also for the vintage girlies, this is Eve's Hollywood by Eve Babbitt. Eve Babbitt was this journalist, writer, party girl, it girl of the late 60s, and this is her love letter to the place she grew up, which is Hollywood, California. Her father was a famous musician. Her mother was a really fun character. This is just a really fun, light but insightful and poignant read. Eve has a sharp wit and a really special way of describing the world around her. I think this is a really gorgeous, romantic snapshot of the late 60s. In this book, she parties with Chicanas, she parties with working girls, and she's just so fun and so earnest. I adore this book. I think it's great for any 60s inspired or 70s inspired girly. Speaking of razor sharp wit, for the 20s and 30s inspired girlies, this book, not much fun. The Lost Poems of Dorothy Parker, they're all terrific. Dorothy Parker was just such a acid-tongued little pistol that this is such a fun read. And she's a little raunchy, she's a little naughty and bawdy. I would say that for someone who has a short attention span or doesn't even particularly like poetry or think poetry is interesting, she will cure them of that, and she's just a live wire. She's fantastic. Love this book. Now, this section of the video is going to be for people who are interested in true crime or human behavior or human psychology. Starting off with the one I don't like quite as much would be DopeWorld. The only reason I don't like this is that I don't like the narration style. It's basically narrated by a drug dealer turned journalist. So he writes from his perspective. This book is a wealth of information, but I do often wish for a more objective narrator. But it is a really fun read. A lot of interesting stuff happens in this book. It's just about the global drug trade from the perspective of someone who was in it. So that's very interesting and cool. Then I really like this book that's Cults, Conspiracies, and Secret Societies. I like this book because it's pretty flip-throughable. If you're kind of wanting to learn more about conspiracies rather than cults, you can kind of flip to the conspiracy section, flip to the cult section. There's just a wealth of information in this book, but it's pretty easy to digest and really interesting and fun. Next, I would say Don't Call It a Cult is a really terrific investigative journalistic look at NXIVM. NXIVM was this business program meant to uplift, junior executives, actors, anyone who wants to get ahead and be successful in life. But of course, there's some really tawdry, disgusting, abusive things happening below the surface. And, the book is a reference to the fact that people hesitate to call it a cult, simply because the trappings of it aren't overtly religious. They're kind of like success-based. There's no religious leader at the top of NXIVM, just like a self-described ethical man who has all of the answers when it comes to getting what you want in life. It's just a really interesting look into like this toxic mentor relationship that Keith Raniere had a lot with his female, followers, and how that quickly devolved into international sex trafficking and immigration fraud. It's a really hard read in some places, but it's very hard to put down. Utterly fascinating. what you think you know about the story is so much worse as detailed by this book. Really well written, fantastic journalism. My favorite nonfiction book of all time, Chaos by Tom O'Neill, is on this list. It's just this really fantastic, exhaustive look about the Tate LaBianca murders and the Manson family. Last summer I read Helter Skelter and then I read Chaos, and Chaos completely blew every fact I learned in Helter Skelter to smithereens. Helter Skelter was written by the lead prosecutor on the Manson case, and so much of what he wrote in Helter Skelter has been debunked by this particular book, Chaos. Chaos also kind of points to this very strange, esoteric CIA connection that the Manson family may have had. It is one of the most mind-boggling books I've ever read. I think it would make a terrific gift for someone who is not paranoid enough. Honorable mention to Cultish, which is about the linguistics of cult psychology, and Murder on Ocean Boulevard, which is a really exhaustive, investigative journalistic look at the death of Rebecca Zahau and whether it was a homicide or a suicide. Both are really, really fascinating and would work well as gifts depending on the interests of the person you're gifting them to. Last, but certainly not least, if you're looking for a book for someone who struggles to finish books, I would highly recommend an Everyman's Library Poetry Anthology. They come in so many different flavors. I've got the blues poems one, I've got the Russian poets one, I've got the poems Bewitched and Haunted for kind of like a Halloween core, Halloween themed series of poems. I've got Killer Verse, Poems of Murder and Mayhem. I've got Poems of the Dead and the Undead. So these would be poems about vampires, zombies, and ghosts. I've got Real Verse, poems about movies and movie theaters. And I've got Monster Verse, and this is my favorite. It's poems about monsters, human and inhuman. These are some of my favorite books in the world. They have some of my favorite poems included in them. I discovered some of my favorite poems in the world in the contents of these little teeny books that you can take in your purse with you anywhere. They're so fantastic, and they come in so many different stripes and flavors. You can get ones about Chinese erotic poetry, you can get a poetry anthology about cats, you can get a poetry anthology of Poe, Baudelaire, Yeats. I mean, these are just exhaustive, and so they can be so personalized to the person you're giving them to. I adore them, can't recommend them enough. Well, that concludes my list of books that I think would make terrific gifts. Let me know what you're reading in the comments, what book that you've recently read that you think would make a great gift. I'm always curious to hear from you. And until next time, bye!